Ukrainian security and defense forces struck Russian frigate Admiral Essen during the overnight attack on March 2nd, and right now this warship is unable to launch cruise missiles. What is your take on that, and also what do you make of this strike in the context of US efforts to involve Ukraine in intercepting Iranian drones in the Middle East?
Well, I think, Daniel, if I can start off with sort of a wider context for these attacks that are taking place on Russian warships. Look, this week, we've not only had the attack that you've mentioned on the Russian warship, we've also had Ukrainian attacks on the port of Novorossiysk in southwest Russia on the Black Sea. And I think there were 3 warships or support ships that were killed, that were damaged in that attack. And then, although it has not been claimed by the Ukrainians, the Russians are saying that they had another ship, a liquefied natural gas carrier, that was hit with an explosion off the coast of Libya overnight. Clearly, I think it's not only the case that Ukraine has been calling for tightening measures against the so-called shadow fleet, those Russian ships that evade sanctions. I think you're seeing increasing action against both Russian warships and also those Russian ships of the shadow fleet, whether it's sanctions, whether it's trying to confiscate those ships, or whether it's trying to damage them and put them out of action. And it just shows another vulnerability of the Russians. I mean, just a quick reminder here, in terms of Ukraine's resilience, if we go back to 2022 and 2023, that's when Russia had control of the Black Sea. That's when it was going to, starve Ukraine into submission by cutting off food exports out of all ports. Well, Ukraine by 2024 had broken that stranglehold on the Black Sea. More than a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet had been damaged or put out of service. Now here we are in 2026, and it's not a question of this happening just in the Black Sea. We're seeing Russian ships elsewhere that are getting attacked. We're seeing Russian ports that are getting attacked. It's not going to bring victory against the Russian invasion, but it is a further constraint on the Russians that not only do they not have naval superiority, they actually have this naval vulnerability, which is being exploited.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Wednesday that Ukraine will send its own military experts to the Middle East to help counter Iranian drones and missiles. Meanwhile, US and several Gulf countries are also considering buying Ukrainian interceptor drones to stop Iranian Shahed drones, according to Financial Times, because Ukrainian drones are much cheaper rather than missiles for US-made Patriot systems. Does it mean that Ukraine still has some important cards on the global stage and some leverage?
Oh, Ukraine is increasingly important in certain sectors of military technology. The fact that you've had to develop that military technology to survive means you are, if you want to use economic terms, you're a market leader in terms of areas such as drone interceptors. So even if there was not a Russian invasion, it would make sense for Ukraine to go to other countries and say, look, you're in need of drone interceptors versus the Iranian drone and missile retaliation. Let's make a deal. I think the question here is what's the deal that Ukraine's trying to strike here? I think one of it's just simply political goodwill. At a critical time in these talks to end the Russian invasion, they're not only showing Europe's already supporting Ukraine, they're showing the Americans, look, we have military technology which is of use to you. Now, don't you think you should be defending our security against Russia for the future? And then, of course, there's the question about whether, in fact, there, would be, all right, if Ukraine gives or provides drone interceptors, can it get, for example, supplies for its air defenses in return? That, I think, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about, because the fundamental here is that those Patriot missiles, which could be used to defend Ukraine against the Russian attacks, are being used to defend Israel or possibly to defend the Gulf states. So in a way, this U.S. Israel war on Iran is double-edged. It does offer an opportunity for Ukraine to show, look, we are a valuable partner here. You need to defend us because we are that valuable partner. But on the other side of this, this also is taking away assets that could be used, to help Ukraine continue to repel those Russian aerial attacks.
Actually, you already discovered this topic, but I also want to go deep because Ukraine could face a shortage of MIM-14 Patriot missile during this conflict in the Middle East. And Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested exchanging Ukrainian interceptor drones for Patriot missiles. And as you already said, that Ukrainian defense system and defense industry could be useful, that's also interesting to hear how exactly this experience could be used in the war in the Middle East and how this conflict actually affect arms supplies to Ukraine in the coming weeks, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I think the problem here is that the Americans can turn around and tell Ukraine, "Oh, well, we'd like to help you, but our Patriots have had to be used elsewhere." And remember, last year that was the excuse that was given by U.S. officials that wanted to cut off assistance to Ukraine, especially an Assistant Secretary of Defense Elbridge Colby. We've done a review of Pentagon stocks. We need these stocks for our own defense. We need them for Asia. We can't provide them to Ukraine. I think this is probably going to increase, it's going to raise, I think, the question of Europe now. It's like, okay, if the Patriots are not available, you would like to have the Patriots, but what alternatives do you have? What systems can you provide? Because remember, when we talk about Patriots, there are the Patriots that the US can provide, but then there's the Patriots that European partners have, like Germany. Now, Germany has said in recent months, we can't give you more Patriots because we need the Patriots. Well, look, come on. Germany, you're not the one that's imminently going to be attacked. So let's talk about what can be done either with German systems, such as the Irish systems, or the Patriots. I think it's just another case of Europe's going to have to step up the support for Ukraine because the U.S. has tied itself down with the choice to go in and wage war on Iran.
I also want to switch to the topic of the three-party negotiations, and we know that talks with Russia, Ukraine, and the US have been postponed, and we don't know when actually they will have a meeting. And one of the official reason is, of course, due to the security concerns, because the meeting had to take place in Abu Dhabi. But do you think this delay is only about safety, or it could also reflect a lack of progress in the peace talks? And how might Russia actually use this time?
Well, Russia was already casting doubt on whether they would go into the fourth set of talks. They were sending out signals, even as President Zelensky was saying, let's have the talks in early March, and the Kremlin was saying, we don't think so. We don't think there's anything to discuss unless you give us what we want, which is, of course, Donbass. But then, of course, where's the U.S. interest in coming into the talks now? I mean, remember this curious feature, which should never have happened, that the same Donald Trump envoys that were handling the Ukraine-Russia talks, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were also the envoys for Iran. So now, with there being a U.S. war on Iran, and with there always being the question of could there be talks to end that war, you expect Witkoff and Kushner to come back and handle Ukraine-Russia talks? Probably not. The Americans are overstretched. This is a really weird situation. This is the most powerful military country in the world. This is a country which has some of the leading technology, but in terms of their diplomacy, they have chosen not to build up career diplomats, not to use career diplomats in the talks. They are using just a couple of people, a few people, let's say, for Gaza, for Iran, and for Ukraine and Russia. That's just not a sensible way to conduct diplomacy or foreign policy, but that's where we are. So no, I think, Ukraine can probably say, we want to have the talks. We're ready for the talks. But at the same time say, we understand their safety concerns. So Ukraine looks good, but they look good realizing we're not going to have the talks in the near future. But again, quick reminder, Ukraine all along has not thought these talks would end in a settlement to end the Russian invasion. Ukraine has always pursued these talks to get the political advantage of being the country that is willing to negotiate, while it's the Kremlin that continues to refuse to make any compromises.
Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.